The morning, Adelaide Northwood carried her first batch of pies into the church basement. She had no idea that grief would one day transform into something she had stopped believing possible. It was April of 1881, and Sierra City, California, still wore the rough edges of a mining town despite the gold having trickled away years before, leaving behind a collection of hardy souls who refused to abandon their stake in the Sierra Nevada foothills. Adelaide's husband, Thomas, had been dead for 8 months, killed when his horse threw him during a winter storm. At 26, she found herself alone in a world that had little patience for solitary women. The small house Thomas had built still needed repairs she could not afford. The garden needed tending. The chickens needed feeding, and Adelaide needed purpose beyond the hollow routine of surviving each day until the next. Reverend Samuel Patterson had suggested the pies after noticing how thin she had grown, how her dresses hung loose on her diminishing frame. The church held a social every Sunday after services, and the good Reverend thought perhaps baking for the congregation might give Adelaide something to focus on besides her loss. What he did not say, but what Adelaide understood perfectly well, was that the church would pay her a modest sum for her efforts. Charity dressed up as commerce, but she was grateful nonetheless. She had always been good with pastry. Her mother had taught her the secret of keeping the butter cold, of working the dough just enough but never too much. That first Sunday, Adelaide brought 3 pies: apple, cherry, and a custard that had been Thomas's favorite. She set them on the long wooden table in the basement where the congregation gathered after Reverend Patterson's sermons, and she tried not to think about how Thomas would never taste her baking again. The pies sold for 50 cents each, sliced into generous portions. The miners and ranchers and shopkeepers who made up Sierra City's faithful lined up with coins in their weathered hands, eager for something sweet after a week of beans and salt pork. Adelaide stood to the side, uncomfortable with the attention, wishing she could simply leave the pies and disappear. That was when she first noticed him. He stood at the back of the line, a tall man in dusty range clothes and a hat pulled low over his face. He did not talk to the other men, did not join in their banter about the weather or the disappointing yield from the claims up in the hills. When his turn came, he pointed to the apple pie and handed over his coins without a word. He took his slice on a tin plate, nodded once in Adelaide's direction, and moved to eat alone in the corner. "That is Franklin Zimmerman," whispered Martha Davies, one of the church ladies who had appointed herself Adelaide's guardian of sorts. "Works the Double Bar Ranch north of town. Keeps to himself, that one. Been coming to services for about 6 months now, but I have never heard him speak more than 2 words together." Adelaide watched Franklin eat her pie with careful, deliberate bites. He was perhaps 30 years old, with sun-darkened skin and the lean build of a man who worked hard for his living. There was something in the way he held himself, a quietness that went beyond mere shyness, that reminded Adelaide of a wild animal uncertain whether to trust the hand that offered food. She thought little more about it until the following Sunday, when Franklin again stood in line for pie. This time she had made 4: 2 apple, 1 peach, and a rhubarb that had required trading 3 dozen eggs to Mrs. Chen at the mercantile for the precious stalks. Franklin bought apple again. Again, he ate alone. Again, he offered nothing but a silent nod in her direction. The pattern continued through spring and into summer. Every Sunday, Adelaide baked her pies. Every Sunday, Franklin bought 1 slice of apple. He never varied his choice, never attempted conversation, never did anything to draw attention to himself. Yet Adelaide found herself watching for him, found herself making sure there was always apple pie available, found herself disappointed on the rare Sunday when ranch business kept him away. "You ought to make an extra apple pie," Martha said one Sunday in June, her knowing eyes twinkling. "Seems there is a particular customer who favors it." Adelaide felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I make what sells best," she said, but it was a weak deflection and they both knew it. The truth was that Adelaide had begun to wonder about Franklin Zimmerman. In a town where everyone talked, he remained a mystery. He worked hard, paid his debts, and bothered no one. He had appeared in Sierra City the previous fall, hired on at the double bar, and kept so thoroughly to himself that even the church ladies, who could usually unearth a man's entire history within a week, knew almost nothing about him. The summer heat settled over the foothills like a wool blanket. The creek that ran through town dwindled to a trickle. Dust coated everything, and tempers grew short in the saloons. Adelaide's garden struggled despite her careful watering, but the chickens continued to lay and she continued to bake. The church socials remained the highlight of her week, the one place where she felt useful, needed, part of something larger than her own small grief. One Sunday in late July, as Adelaide was packing up the empty pie tins, Franklin approached her table. She had been wiping down the wooden surface, her back to the room, and did not hear him coming. When she turned and found him standing there, silent as a shadow, she gasped and dropped her cloth. "I am sorry," he said, and his voice was rough, unpracticed, as though he did not use it often. "Did not mean to startle you, madam." Adelaide pressed a hand to her chest, feeling her heart hammer beneath her palm. "It is quite all right. I was simply lost in thought." They stood there in awkward silence. Franklin held his hat in his hands, turning it slowly by the brim. Up close, Adelaide could see that his eyes were a clear gray like creek water over stone. There were lines at the corners, carved by sun and wind and perhaps something deeper. "I wanted to say," Franklin began, then stopped. He cleared his throat. "Your pies, they are very fine. The best I have ever eaten." The compliment, simple as it was, struck Adelaide with unexpected force. "Thank you," she managed. "That is very kind." Another silence, longer this time. Adelaide found herself searching for something to say, some way to extend this fragile moment of connection. But before she could speak, Franklin nodded once, replaced his hat, and walked away. That night, lying alone in her bed, Adelaide thought about the way Franklin's voice had sounded, hesitant and careful. She thought about his gray eyes and the way he held his hat like a shield. She thought about the fact that for 8 months, she had barely noticed the world around her, so consumed by grief that she had moved through her days like a ghost. And now, because of a quiet cowboy who bought apple pie every Sunday, she found herself feeling something other than numbness. It frightened her, this small awakening. Loving Thomas had been easy, natural as breathing. They had grown up together, married at 18, built their life with the unquestioning certainty of youth. His death had shattered her, and she had assumed the broken pieces would never fit together quite right again. The idea that she might feel something for another man, might want something beyond mere survival, seemed like a betrayal of everything she and Thomas had shared. Yet as summer faded into fall, Adelaide could not deny the truth. She looked forward to Sundays with an anticipation that had nothing to do with church services or even the pleasure of baking. She found herself taking extra care with her appearance, pinning her dark hair more carefully, wearing her better dress. She made sure the apple pies were perfect, the crust golden and flaky, the filling fragrant with cinnamon. Franklin, for his part, remained consistent. Every Sunday, he bought his slice of pie. Every few weeks, he would linger long enough to offer a brief compliment or comment on the weather. Adelaide hoarded these small exchanges like precious stones, turning them over in her mind during the long, quiet evenings. The first real conversation happened in September, on a Sunday when an early storm rolled through the mountains. Rain drummed on the church roof during services, and by the time the congregation moved to the basement for the social, water was running in streams down the street outside. Most folks hurried through their refreshments, eager to get home before the roads turned to mud. Adelaide was loading her pie tins into a basket when she realized the rain had intensified. She had walked to church, as she always did, and the thought of the half-mile journey home in this downpour made her heart sink. She was standing at the basement door, watching the deluge when Franklin appeared at her elbow. "I have a wagon," he said. "I could drive you home if you would like." Adelaide turned to look at him. Rain had darkened his hat and the shoulders of his coat. He must have already been outside, perhaps bringing his wagon closer to the church. The offer was simple, practical, and yet Adelaide felt a flutter of something that might have been nervousness or might have been something else entirely. "I would not want to take you out of your way," she said. "It is no trouble." The wagon was an old farm wagon, sturdy and utilitarian. Franklin helped Adelaide up to the bench seat, his hand firm under her elbow, and then climbed up beside her. The rain beat down on the canvas cover stretched over the wagon bed, creating a small dry cave around them. Franklin clicked to the horses and they moved forward into the storm. They rode in silence for a few minutes, the only sounds the rain and the creak of the wagon and the steady clip of the horses' hooves. Adelaide sat very still, acutely aware of Franklin's presence beside her, the warmth of him in the damp air. "I live just past the old Miller place," she said, breaking the silence. "The small house with the green shutters." "I know it," Franklin said, and Adelaide wondered how he knew where she lived, wondered if he had thought about her outside of Sunday mornings, wondered if she had been alone in this strange, tentative awareness. "You work at the Double Bar," Adelaide said, making it a statement rather than a question. "Yes, madam, coming up on a year now. Do you like it? The work, I mean." Franklin was quiet for a moment, guiding the horses around a particularly deep puddle. "It is good work. The foreman is fair. The other hands keep mostly to themselves, which suits me." Adelaide heard something in his tone, a wariness that spoke of old wounds. "Where did you work before, if you do not mind my asking?" "All over. Colorado, Wyoming, down in Arizona for a spell." He paused. "I move around a lot." "Or I did anyway." "And now," he turned to look at her then, his gray eyes serious. "Now I am thinking maybe it is time to stay put for a while." There was something in the way he said it, a weight of meaning that made Adelaide's breath catch. Before she could respond, they arrived at her house. Franklin pulled the wagon up to the porch and set the brake. "Thank you," Adelaide said, "for the ride. It was very kind of you." Franklin climbed down and came around to help her. This time, when his hands circled her waist to lift her from the wagon, Adelaide felt the strength in them, the careful gentleness. Her feet touched the ground, but he did not immediately release her. They stood there in the rain, close enough that Adelaide could see the water droplets caught in his eyelashes. "Adelaide," he said, her given name sounding strange and wonderful in his rough voice. "I wonder if, that is, I would like to." He trailed off, frustrated, and Adelaide understood that whatever he wanted to say was costing him dearly. On impulse, driven by something she did not fully understand, she reached out and touched his hand. "Would you like to come for supper sometime?" she asked. "As thanks for the ride." The relief that flooded his face was answer enough. "I would like that very much." They agreed on the following Saturday. Franklin helped her carry her pie tins to the porch, tipped his hat, and drove away into the rain. Adelaide stood on her porch long after the wagon had disappeared, her hand still tingling where it had touched his, her heart doing complicated things in her chest. The week that followed was the longest of Adelaide's life. She found herself constantly distracted, burning the bread, feeding the chickens twice because she forgot she had already done it. Martha noticed her preoccupation at the Wednesday prayer meeting and cornered her afterward. "Adelaide Northwood, you have been walking around with your head in the clouds all week. What has gotten into you?" Adelaide trusted Martha more than anyone in Sierra City. The older woman had been unfailingly kind since Thomas's death, bringing casseroles and practical advice in equal measure. Still, Adelaide found herself reluctant to share what she was feeling, as though speaking it aloud might somehow break the spell. "Franklin Zimmerman is coming to supper on Saturday," she said finally. Martha's face lit up. "Is he now? Well, it is about time." "What do you mean?" "Child, that man has been sweet on you since the first time he saw you. Anyone with eyes could see it." Adelaide shook her head. "He just buys pie every Sunday. That does not mean he buys your pie every Sunday. He speaks to you, which he does not do with anyone else. And I saw him drive you home last week in the rain." Martha patted Adelaide's hand. "It is all right to let yourself feel something again, dear. Thomas would not want you to spend the rest of your life alone." The words, meant kindly, still pierced Adelaide's heart. "It has not even been a year," she whispered. "There is no right timeline for grief," Martha said gently. "And there is nothing wrong with friendship, with companionship. You do not have to decide anything right now. Just enjoy a nice supper with a good man." Saturday arrived with clear skies and a hint of autumn coolness in the air. Adelaide spent the day in a frenzy of preparation. She cleaned the house from top to bottom, though it was already clean. She picked the last of the tomatoes from her struggling garden and baked a chicken with herbs. She made biscuits and green beans and, of course, a pie. Apple, because it was his favorite. Franklin arrived precisely at 6, as they had arranged. He had bathed and shaved and wore clean clothes, though they were still the simple garments of a working cowboy. He brought wildflowers clutched in one large hand, their stems wrapped in a damp cloth. "I picked these up in the high meadow," he said, offering them to Adelaide. "They are not much, but I thought—" "They are beautiful," Adelaide said, and meant it. The wildflowers, purple and yellow and white, were far lovelier than any hothouse roses. She arranged them in a mason jar and set them in the center of her small kitchen table. The meal began awkwardly, both of them too aware of each other, too uncertain of what this evening meant. But gradually, as they ate, they began to talk. Adelaide asked about the ranch, and Franklin told her about the cattle and horses, about mending fences and checking water sources. His words came slowly at first, but as he relaxed, he spoke more freely. "I always wanted to work with horses," he said. "Even as a boy, they made more sense to me than people." "Where did you grow up?" Adelaide asked. Franklin's face shuddered slightly. "Missouri, small farm outside of Independence. My father raised corn and a little tobacco." "Do you have family there still?" "No." The word was flat, final. "They are all gone now." Adelaide heard the pain beneath the simple statement and did not push. Instead, she told him about her own childhood in Sacramento, about moving to Sierra City with Thomas after their marriage, about their dreams of building something lasting in the mountains. "He was a good man," Franklin said. "Your husband. I can tell by the way you speak of him." Adelaide felt tears prick her eyes. Most people avoided mentioning Thomas as though his death was something shameful that should not be acknowledged. But there was no pity in Franklin's voice, just simple understanding. "He was," she said. "We were very happy, and then one day he was just gone, and I did not know how to be in the world without him." "I understand that," Franklin said quietly. "Losing someone that matters. Feeling like you have lost yourself along with them." Their eyes met across the table. and Adelaide saw in Franklin's face an echo of her own grief. She did not know what he had lost, but she recognized the shape of it, the way it had carved him hollow and left him wary of filling the empty spaces. After supper, they sat on the porch and watched the sun set behind the mountains. The evening air was cool and sweet, carrying the scent of pine from the slopes above town. Franklin told her about the different ranches where he had worked, the country he had seen. Adelaide told him about her baking, about the satisfaction of creating something with her own hands. "That apple pie today," Franklin said. "It was especially good." Adelaide laughed. "I make it the same way every week." "Maybe so, but today it tasted better." He paused, then added with a directness that surprised her, "Maybe because I was eating it here with you." Adelaide's breath caught. In the fading light, Franklin's profile was sharp and handsome, and she felt a pull toward him that was both thrilling and terrifying. "Franklin," she said, "why did you ask me to call you by your given name? That day in the rain." He turned to look at her, his gray eyes serious. "Because I wanted to hear you say it. Because I have been coming to that church every Sunday for months just to buy a slice of pie from you. Because I am not good with words, Adelaide, but I know how I feel." "How do you feel?" "Like I have been wandering for years, and I finally found a place I want to stop." The words, simple and honest, broke something open in Adelaide's chest. She reached for his hand, and he took it, his rough fingers closing gently around hers. "I am frightened," she admitted, "of feeling this way, of what it might mean." "I am too," Franklin said. "But I am more frightened of walking away and spending the rest of my life wondering what might have been." They sat there holding hands until the stars came out, until the chill in the air drove them inside. Franklin left soon after, but at the door he paused. "Could I come calling again?" "Proper like I mean," Adelaide smiled. "I would like that." He leaned down and pressed a gentle kiss to her forehead, a gesture so tender it made her eyes sting. Then he was gone, walking down the road toward town, and Adelaide was left standing in her doorway with her heart beating fast and her mind whirling with possibility. The courtship that followed was slow and careful, two wounded people learning to trust again. Franklin came for supper every Saturday, and gradually his presence in Adelaide's home began to feel natural, right. He fixed the broken step on her porch, repaired the fence around her chicken coop, helped her prepare the garden for winter. Adelaide cooked for him and talked with him and slowly, carefully, led him into the guarded places of her heart. On Sundays, Franklin still bought his slice of apple pie, but now when he ate it, he sat with Adelaide instead of alone in the corner. The congregation noticed, of course, and the gossip mill churned, but it was gentle gossip, approving. Adelaide was well-liked, and people were glad to see her emerging from her grief. "That Franklin is a good man," Reverend Patterson told her one Sunday. "Quiet but solid. The kind you can depend on." Adelaide was beginning to understand that this was true. Franklin's quietness was not weakness but strength, a deep steadiness that came from having weathered storms and survived them. He did not speak often, but when he did, his words mattered. He did not make promises lightly, but once made, he kept them. As autumn deepened into winter, Adelaide realized she was falling in love. It was different from what she had felt for Thomas, less the giddy rush of youth and more the steady warmth of a well-built fire. She loved the way Franklin listened when she talked, really listened, as though her words were precious. She loved his gentle hands and his rare smile. She loved the way he seemed to understand her silences, the moments when grief still caught her unexpectedly. One Saturday in November, as they were finishing supper, Franklin set down his fork and looked at her with an expression she could not quite read. "Adelaide, there is something I need to tell you about my past." She felt a flutter of apprehension but kept her voice calm. "All right." Franklin took a breath, his hands flat on the table. "I was married once. Her name was Catherine. We had a little girl, Emmy. She was 3 years old." Adelaide's heart clenched. The use of the past tense told her everything. "What happened?" "Cholera. Summer of '77, down in Kansas. It swept through our town like wildfire. Catherine got sick first, then Emmy. They died within days of each other." His voice was steady, but his knuckles were white where he gripped the table edge. "I buried them in the town cemetery and I left. Could not stand to be in that place anymore, seeing the house we had lived in, the dreams we had made. So I started drifting. Told myself I was looking for work, but really I was just trying to outrun the memories." Adelaide reached across the table and covered his hands with hers. "I am so sorry, Franklin. That is a terrible burden to carry." "I loved them," he said. "Catherine and Emmy. I loved them with everything I had, and when they died I thought that was it for me. Thought I would spend the rest of my life alone, because I could not bear the thought of loving someone again only to lose them." "What changed?" He looked up at her, his gray eyes bright with unshed tears. "I saw you. That first Sunday, standing by your pies, looking so lost and brave at the same time. And I thought, there is someone else who understands, someone else who knows what it is to have your heart broken clean through." "So you bought a pie," Adelaide said softly. "So I bought a pie. And then I kept buying pies, because it gave me a reason to be near you, because something about you made me feel a little less alone." He turned his hands over and gripped hers tightly. "I am not trying to replace Thomas in your heart, Adelaide. I know I cannot do that, and I would not want to. But I am asking if there might be room there for me anyway, because I love you. I have loved you for months now, and I cannot keep it to myself anymore." Adelaide felt tears spill down her cheeks. "I love you too," she whispered. "I tried not to. I felt guilty for feeling anything. But I love you, Franklin. I love your kindness and your quiet strength. I love the way you have been patient with me, letting me come to this in my own time." Franklin stood and came around the table, pulling her gently to her feet. He cupped her face in his hands and kissed her, and Adelaide felt something inside her that had been frozen for so long finally begin to thaw. The kiss was tender and careful, a promise and a question all at once. When they broke apart, Franklin rested his forehead against hers. "Marry me, Adelaide. I know it has not been a full year since Thomas died, and if you need more time, I will wait. I will wait as long as you need. But I am asking now because I want you to know how sure I am. I want to build a life with you. I want to wake up next to you every morning and eat your apple pie every Sunday until we are old and gray." Adelaide laughed through her tears. "Yes, yes, I will marry you." They were married in the spring of 1882, on a Sunday morning in the same church where Adelaide had sold her pies and Franklin had quietly fallen in love. The ceremony was simple, attended by the whole town, it seemed. Martha wept happily. Reverend Patterson beamed. And when Franklin slipped the ring onto Adelaide's finger, she felt Thomas's memory settle into something peaceful rather than painful. A cherished part of her past that would always be with her but no longer defined her. The wedding breakfast was held in the church basement, and Adelaide had baked pies. A dozen of them, all different kinds. A celebration of the simple ritual that had brought her and Franklin together. But the centerpiece, the largest and most beautiful, was an apple pie with a lattice crust, golden and perfect. "For my husband," Adelaide said, cutting the first slice and handing it to Franklin, "who bought apple pie every week for a year." Franklin took the plate, but before he ate, he pulled Adelaide close and kissed her in front of everyone, to much cheering and applause. When he finally took a bite, he smiled, that rare, wonderful smile that transformed his whole face. "Best pie I ever tasted," he said, and Adelaide knew he was not just talking about the pastry. They moved into Adelaide's small house, the one Thomas had built, and Franklin made it bigger, adding a room and a proper porch. He continued to work at the double bar, and Adelaide continued to bake pies for the church socials. But now Franklin did not eat alone in the corner. He sat with his wife, and they shared the pie, and they talked and laughed with their neighbors. Life was not perfect. There were hard days when grief caught one or both of them unexpectedly. Adelaide would see something that reminded her of Thomas and feel the loss all over again. Franklin would wake from nightmares of Catherine and Emmy, and Adelaide would hold him until the shaking stopped. But they weathered these storms together, finding strength in each other, learning that love did not erase the past, but could make the present bearable and the future hopeful. In the fall of 1882, Adelaide realized she was pregnant. The discovery brought a tangle of emotions, joy and fear and guilt and wonder all mixed together. She told Franklin one evening as they sat on their porch, watching the sun set. "A baby," he said, his voice full of awe. He placed his hand gently on her still, flat belly. "We are going to have a baby." "Are you happy?" Adelaide asked, searching his face. "Happy does not even begin to cover it," Franklin said. "I am terrified and thrilled and grateful all at once." He pulled her close. "This baby is not replacing Emmy, just like you did not replace Catherine. This is new. This is ours. And I cannot wait to meet this little person." Their son was born in the spring of 1883, a healthy boy with his mother's dark hair and his father's gray eyes. They named him Joseph Thomas Zimmerman, honoring the husband Adelaide had lost and claiming the new life they were building together. Franklin held the baby with the careful tenderness of a man who knew how precious and fragile life was. And Adelaide watched him rock their son, and felt her heart expand in ways she had not known possible. Joseph was followed by a daughter, Sarah, 2 years later, and then another son, William, 2 years after that. The small house grew crowded and loud, full of the beautiful chaos of family life. Franklin proved to be a devoted father, patient and kind, teaching his children to ride and rope, reading to them every evening before bed. Adelaide watched him with their children and fell in love with him all over again, deeper this time, rooted in the daily reality of shared life. The years passed in the way years do, marked by seasons and harvests, births and deaths, joy and sorrow in equal measure. Sierra City changed around them. The mining dwindled to almost nothing, but the town persisted, sustained by ranching and farming and the stubborn determination of people who had put down roots. The church remained the center of community life, and Adelaide's pies remained a Sunday tradition. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Franklin surprised Adelaide by taking her on a picnic up in the high meadow where he had picked wildflowers for her all those years ago. The children were left with Martha for the afternoon, and Franklin and Adelaide rode up the mountain trail on horseback, a basket of food and a blanket tied to Franklin's saddle. The meadow was in full bloom, a riot of color against the deep green of the pines and the blue of the sky. They spread their blanket near a stream and ate cold chicken and biscuits and, of course, apple pie that Adelaide had baked that morning. "You remember the first time I drove you home in the rain?" Franklin asked, lying back on the blanket with his hat over his face to shade the sun. "Of course," Adelaide said. "I was so nervous I could barely speak. You were not the only one. I thought my heart was going to beat right out of my chest." He moved his hat and looked at her, his gray eyes warm. "I almost did not offer you the ride, almost talked myself out of it." "I am glad I did not." Adelaide lay down beside him, her head on his shoulder. "I am glad too. I am glad for all of it, even the hard parts, even the grief and the fear, because it brought us here." "Are you happy, Adelaide?" She thought about the question, really considered it. She thought about Thomas and the young woman she had been when she loved him, full of untested dreams and easy certainty. She thought about the widow who had baked pies in a church basement, hollow with grief, just trying to survive. And she thought about the woman she was now, wife, mother, beloved and loving, scarred but whole. "Yes," she said, "I am happy." They made love there in the meadow, under the open sky, with the kind of easy passion that came from years of knowing each other's bodies and hearts. Afterward, they lay tangled together, listening to the stream and the wind in the pines. "I want to grow old with you," Franklin said. "I want to watch our children grow up and have children of their own. I want to sit on our porch when we are 70 and eat apple pie and remember all of this." "That sounds perfect," Adelaide said, and it was perfect, or as close to perfect as real life ever gets. They had their struggles, of course. Money was often tight. The ranch work was hard and sometimes dangerous. The children got sick, though mercifully never seriously. There were arguments and frustrations and days when the weight of responsibility felt crushing, but there was also so much joy. Joseph grew into a thoughtful boy who loved books and horses in equal measure. Sarah inherited her mother's gift for baking and her father's quiet strength. William was the wild one, always getting into scrapes, keeping them laughing and worried in turns. The house that had once been a place of loneliness became filled with noise and life and love. Franklin thrived as a husband and father in ways he had never quite managed as a solitary cowboy. The shadows that had haunted him for so long gradually faded, replaced by contentment. He still worked hard, but he came home every evening to a warm house and a family that adored him. He taught his sons the skills they would need to make their way in the world, and he taught his daughter that she was every bit as capable as her brothers. Adelaide continued to bake pies for the church, and over the years, she trained other women in her methods. The Sunday socials remained a treasured tradition, and Adelaide's pies remained legendary. But her favorite part was still watching Franklin buy his slice of apple pie, even though he could have it at home any time he wanted. "It is tradition," he would say when she teased him about it. "You do not mess with tradition." As their children grew, Adelaide and Franklin began to look toward the future. Joseph showed an interest in teaching and went off to Sacramento to study at the normal school there. Sarah married a young rancher from the next valley over, a good man who looked at her the way Franklin looked at Adelaide. William, restless like his father had once been, talked about seeing the world, and though it pained Adelaide to think of him leaving, she understood the need. Through it all, Adelaide and Franklin remained each other's anchors. They had learned through hard experience that life was fragile and precious, that love was both a gift and a choice that had to be made again and again. They chose each other every day, in the big moments and the small ones, in sickness and health, in good times and bad. On a Sunday, in the fall of 1902, Adelaide and Franklin celebrated their 20th wedding anniversary. Their children, all grown now but gathered for the occasion, threw them a party in the church basement, the same room where their love story had begun. The tables were laden with food, including no fewer than 15 pies of all varieties. But the centerpiece, made by Sarah with her mother's guidance, was a perfect apple pie. Reverend Patterson, now elderly and preparing to retire, raised his glass in a toast. "To Adelaide and Franklin Zimmerman, who have shown us all what true love looks like. May you have many more years of happiness together." The crowd cheered and clinked glasses. Franklin stood and pulled Adelaide to her feet, wrapping his arms around her. 20 years, he said softly, so only she could hear. "And I love you more now than I did the day we married." "Only because I feed you pie," Adelaide teased. "Well, that does not hurt," Franklin admitted, his eyes twinkling. Then he grew serious. "Thank you, Adelaide, for taking a chance on a quiet cowboy who did not know how to say what he felt, for building this life with me, for giving me a family and a home and a reason to stop running." Adelaide kissed him, not caring that their children and half the town were watching. "Thank you for buying pie every week for a year, for being patient, for loving me when I thought I could never love again." As the party continued around them, Adelaide looked at the life they had built together. Her children, healthy and happy and loved. Her husband, still handsome despite the gray in his hair and the lines on his face, still strong and steady and true. The community they had become part of, the roots they had put down in this mountain town. It had started with pie. With a widow trying to find purpose in her grief and a cowboy trying to find the courage to speak his heart. It had grown into something neither of them could have imagined. A love that honored the past while embracing the future. A family built on loss and hope in equal measure. A life that was messy and beautiful and real. The years that followed their 20th anniversary were sweet ones. Franklin, now in his early 50s, took on more of a supervisory role at the Double Bar Ranch, training younger men rather than doing all the hard physical labor himself. Adelaide, her dark hair now threaded with silver, continued to bake, though she had passed the primary responsibility for the church pies on to Sarah and the other younger women. They traveled some, taking the train to Sacramento to visit Joseph, who had become a schoolteacher and married a lovely young woman named Grace. They attended Sarah's children's christenings and school programs. They even ventured as far as San Francisco once, where William was working as a clerk in a shipping office, having decided after a few years of wandering that he preferred city life to ranching. But they always came home to Sierra City, to the house Franklin had built onto and improved over the years, to the mountains and the church and the community that had witnessed their love story unfold. They were fixtures in town, respected and beloved, the kind of couple that younger people pointed to as an example of what marriage should be. On Sunday mornings, they still attended services together. Adelaide no longer sold pies every week, but she still brought them for special occasions. And Franklin still insisted on buying the first slice of apple pie, still handed over his coins with mock solemnity while Adelaide pretended to be exasperated, and everyone else smiled knowingly. One Sunday evening in the summer of 1910, Adelaide and Franklin sat on their porch watching the sunset, as they had done countless times over the years. Adelaide was knitting a blanket for Joseph's expected baby, her third grandchild. Franklin was whittling, his skilled hands shaping a wooden horse for Sarah's youngest son. "Do you ever think about how things might have been different?" Adelaide asked. "If you had not bought that first pie, if I had not invited you to supper?" Franklin considered the question, his knife moving steadily through the wood. "Sometimes," he admitted, "but not in a wishing way, more like wondering at how lucky I was, how easily I might have missed this." "Me too," Adelaide said. "I think about how lost I was after Thomas died. How I thought my life was over at 26. I could have stayed stuck in that grief forever. But you did not. No, because you bought apple pie every Sunday, because you were patient and kind and willing to wait for me to be ready." She set down her knitting and reached for his hand. "You saved me, Franklin." He shook his head. "We saved each other. I was just as lost as you were, Adelaide, just wandering in a different way. You gave me a reason to stop, to put down roots, to believe that I deserved another chance at happiness." They sat in comfortable silence as the sky turned from gold to pink to purple. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled. The air smelled of pine and the roses Adelaide had planted along the porch. "I hope it lasts forever," Adelaide said. This, us, all of it. Nothing lasts forever, Franklin said gently. We both know that. But we have had 30 years together, Adelaide, 30 good years. And however many more we get, I will be grateful for every single day. It was a practical sentiment, tinged with the realism of people who had known loss. But there was also deep love in it, appreciation for what they had built together, acceptance that life was both precious and temporary. They were granted another 15 years. 15 years of watching grandchildren grow, of Sunday dinners with extended family crowding their table, of quiet evenings on the porch and the comfortable rhythms of long marriage. Franklin's hands eventually grew too stiff with arthritis for ranch work, so he took up furniture making instead, crafting beautiful pieces that people commissioned from all over the county. Adelaide's vision dimmed, but she could still bake by touch and memory, still produced pies that were the standard by which all others were judged. Franklin died in his sleep in the winter of 1925, at the age of 74. He went to bed one night beside the woman he loved and simply did not wake up. The doctor said his heart had given out, worn down by years of hard work and hard living before he had found Adelaide. But to Adelaide, it seemed fitting somehow that his heart, which had been so badly broken and had healed so well, had simply decided it had done its work. The funeral was held on a Sunday, of course, at the church where their story had begun. The building was packed with family and friends, people whose lives Franklin had touched with his quiet kindness and steady presence. Joseph came from Sacramento. Sarah came from her ranch in the next valley. William came all the way from San Francisco, where he now ran his own business. The grandchildren, 7 in all, served as pallbearers and mourners. Adelaide sat in the front pew, flanked by her children, and listened to Reverend Patterson's young replacement speak about Franklin's life. The words were kind and true, but they could not capture the fullness of the man she had loved for more than 40 years. They could not capture the way his eyes had lit up when he smiled, or the gentle strength of his hands, or the devotion with which he had loved his family. After the service, after Franklin had been laid to rest in the cemetery on the hill overlooking town, the congregation gathered in the church basement for the reception. And there, on the long wooden table where Adelaide had once sold pies to pay her bills and keep herself sane, sat a dozen apple pies that her daughters-in-law and granddaughters had made according to her recipe. For Franklin, Sarah said, her eyes bright with tears. He would want there to be pie. Adelaide cut the first slice with shaking hands and took a bite. It was perfect, just the way Franklin had always loved it. The crust flaky and buttery, the apples tender and sweet with just a hint of tartness, the cinnamon warm and fragrant. She could almost hear his voice saying, "Best pie I ever tasted." The grief was enormous, a tidal wave that threatened to pull her under. But this time, Adelaide was not alone in it. She had her children and grandchildren around her. She had a community that loved her. And she had 43 years of memories to sustain her. Memories of love and laughter, of quiet Sunday mornings and noisy family dinners, of a life built from the ruins of loss into something beautiful and enduring. Adelaide lived another 5 years after Franklin's death. She spent that time surrounded by family, taking joy in her grandchildren and great-grandchildren, passing on her recipes and her stories. She spoke often of Franklin, keeping his memory alive for the younger generations who had not known him as well. On Sundays, she still attended church, though she could no longer walk the half-mile from her house and had to be driven. She still brought pies, though Sarah did most of the actual baking now. And she still smiled when she saw couples courting awkwardly in the basement after services, remembering when she and Franklin had been those people, hesitant and hopeful, and falling in love over slices of apple pie. Adelaide Zimmerman died peacefully in her sleep in the spring of 1930, at the age of 75. Her children found her in her bed with a smile on her face, and they liked to think she had been dreaming of Franklin, of being young again and watching him eat pie in the corner of the church basement, neither of them knowing yet how their story would unfold. She was buried next to Franklin on the hill overlooking Sierra City. The funeral was another Sunday affair, well attended and full of tears and laughter both. And at the reception afterward, in the church basement where it had all begun, there were pies. Dozens of them, made by Adelaide's daughters and granddaughters and great-granddaughters, each one carrying forward the tradition she had started so many years ago when she was a young widow just trying to survive her grief. Joseph, now an elderly man himself, stood to speak about his mother. He talked about her strength and her kindness, her skill with pastry and her gift for making people feel welcome. But mostly, he talked about the love story his parents had shared. "My mother used to say that she had two great loves in her life," Joseph told the gathered crowd. "My father Thomas, who she married young and lost too soon, and my father Franklin, who waited patiently for her heart to heal and then loved her with everything he had. She said both men had given her beautiful lives, and she was grateful for every moment of both. She taught us that love does not diminish when it is shared, that the heart has room for all the people and experiences that shape us. She taught us that grief and joy can coexist, that moving forward does not mean forgetting what came before." He paused, his voice thick with emotion. "And she taught us that sometimes the most important things in life start small. A slice of pie, a quiet gesture, a willingness to be open to possibility even when it seems impossible. My parents' love story began with pie, and it ended with a life so full and rich that we are all better for having witnessed it. I hope we all find that kind of love in our lives, the kind that starts with a small gesture and grows into something that lasts beyond death, that echoes through generations." The crowd murmured agreement, and then they ate pie and told stories and celebrated the life of Adelaide Northwood Zimmerman, who had baked pies for the church and found love with a quiet cowboy who bought one every week for a year. Years later, when Sierra City erected a small historical marker commemorating the notable residents who had helped shape the town, Adelaide and Franklin were among those honored. The plaque mentioned Franklin's work on the Double Bar Ranch and his later furniture making. It mentioned Adelaide's community service and her legendary pies, but it also told their love story, in brief. How a widow and a cowboy had found each other in the aftermath of loss and built a life together that had touched everyone around them. The marker stood in front of the church, and on Sundays, families would sometimes pause to read it before going inside for services. Parents would point it out to their children, using Adelaide and Franklin's story to illustrate the power of patience, of kindness, of showing up week after week, even when you do not know how to say what you feel. And in the church basement, where coffee and fellowship followed every service, there were always pies. The tradition Adelaide had started more than 50 years earlier continued, passed down through generations of women who had learned at her knee or from those who had. The recipes evolved slightly over time, incorporating new ingredients and techniques, but there was always apple pie, made the old way, with cold butter and a light hand and plenty of cinnamon. Sometimes, young couples courting would share a slice, feeding each other bites and laughing, not knowing that they were echoing a story that had begun in that very room decades earlier. Sometimes, elderly widows and widowers would sit alone with their pie, drawing comfort from the sweetness and the familiar ritual, finding strength to face another week. The church itself stood for many more decades, a constant in a changing world. Sierra City shrank and grew and shrank again as economic tides shifted. The mining was long gone, replaced by tourism and telecommuting and the kinds of businesses that could exist anywhere. The Double Bar Ranch was subdivided and sold off. The landscape changed, but the mountains remained and the church remained, and the memory of Adelaide and Franklin remained. Their great-great-grandchildren, scattered across California and beyond, still told the story of how their ancestors had met. It became family legend, polished smooth by repeated telling. The grieving widow, the silent cowboy, the weekly ritual of pie that became courtship that became a love that lasted a lifetime. The details might shift slightly in the telling, but the heart of the story remained true. That love can grow from the smallest gestures, that patience and kindness matter, that it is never too late to open your heart again. The recipe for Adelaide's apple pie was written down and passed along, treasured like the heirloom it was. At family gatherings, someone would inevitably make it, and as they ate, they would remember. They would remember Adelaide, who had taken her grief and turned it into something beautiful. They would remember Franklin, who had loved so quietly and so deeply. They would remember that their family had been born from loss and hope, from apple pie and Sunday mornings, from two people brave enough to risk their broken hearts one more time. And in that remembering, Adelaide and Franklin's love lived on, a testament to the enduring power of showing up, of being patient, of buying pie every Sunday for a year until the woman you love is ready to love you back. It was a simple story, really, the kind that happened every day in small towns across the West. But it was also extraordinary, the way all true love stories are extraordinary to the people who live them. The church building eventually grew too old to save, and in the 1980s, it was torn down and replaced with a newer structure. But before the demolition, the Historical Society carefully removed the marker about Adelaide and Franklin, and it was reinstalled in front of the new building. The church basement, where so many Sunday socials had been held, where so many pies had been sold and eaten, where Adelaide and Franklin's love had first taken root, was photographed and documented before being destroyed. One of those photographs showed the long wooden table, worn smooth by decades of use, where Adelaide had once displayed her pies. Another showed the corner where Franklin had eaten alone for months before finding the courage to speak. These images were preserved in the Sierra City Museum, along with other artifacts from the town's history, mining equipment, old photographs, a ledger from the general store. But the museum also had personal items donated by Adelaide and Franklin's descendants. Franklin's woodworking tools, Adelaide's handwritten recipe book, the pages stained and splattered with years of use. A tintype photograph from their wedding day, Adelaide in a simple white dress and Franklin in his best suit, both of them looking solemn and young and hopeful. And in a glass case all its own, a pie tin that had belonged to Adelaide, dented and darkened with age but still serviceable, still carrying the echo of all the pies it had held. Visitors to the museum, especially those interested in genealogy or local history, would often pause at the exhibit about Adelaide and Franklin. They would raid the story, look at the artifacts, and feel a connection across the years to these two people who had loved and lost and loved again. Some visitors were descendants, come to see the evidence of their family history. Others were strangers, drawn by the simple beauty of the story. And every now and then, a visitor would leave the museum and walk to the bakery on Main Street, the one that had been there since the 1920s, and order a slice of apple pie. They would eat it slowly, savoring each bite, and think about love and loss and the courage it takes to try again. They would think about a quiet cowboy who bought pie every week for a year, and a widow who learned to trust her heart again. The story of Adelaide and Franklin became more than just history. It became inspiration, a reminder that even in the hardest times, connection is possible. That grief does not have to be the end of the story. That sometimes the most profound love grows slowly, rooted in small, consistent acts of kindness and presence. Their descendants carried forward the lessons Adelaide and Franklin had taught, not just through words but through the way they lived their lives. They loved generously and grieved honestly. They showed up for each other and their communities. They baked pies for church socials and potlucks and family gatherings, continuing the tradition that had started with a widow trying to find purpose and a cowboy trying to find courage. In the end, Adelaide and Franklin's legacy was not the pies or the furniture or even the children and grandchildren who carried their names. Their legacy was the proof that love can heal, that second chances are real, that patience and persistence matter. They showed that a life can hold multiple chapters, that the heart can break and break and mend again, that endings can also be beginnings if you are brave enough to let them. And so the story of the widow who baked pies and the quiet cowboy who bought one every week for a year lived on, passed down through generations, preserved in museum exhibits and historical markers, but most importantly, kept alive in the hearts of those who heard it and recognized in it something true and beautiful and worth remembering. On Sunday mornings in Sierra City, in the new church building that stood where the old one had been, the congregation still gathered for fellowship after services. There was still coffee and conversation, still laughter and community. And yes, there were still pies, brought by members of the congregation who had learned from their mothers and grandmothers, who carried forward a tradition that stretched back more than a century. The apple pies were always the first to go, just as they had been in Adelaide's day. And if you listened carefully in the sounds of fellowship and friendship, you could almost hear the echo of an old story, the scrape of a fork on a tin plate, the quiet words of a cowboy finding his voice, the laughter of a widow learning to hope again. It was a good story, a true story. A love story that had started with pie and grown into something that transcended time and death, something that reminded everyone who heard it that love, in all its forms, is worth the risk. That showing up matters. That the smallest gesture, repeated with faithfulness and hope, can change everything. And in the end, that was Adelaide and Franklin's gift to the world. Not just their own happy ending, but the promise that happy endings are possible, even after heartbreak, even in the wilderness, even when it seems impossible. You just have to be brave enough to bake the pie, to buy the pie, to take that first small step toward connection. The rest, as their story proved, will follow in its own time, in its own way, one Sunday at a time, one slice of pie at a time, one quiet act of love at a time, until suddenly you look up and realize you have built a lifetime together, a legacy that will outlive you, a love story worth telling for generations to come.